Welcome, everyone. We are 3 minutes after, so we are officially getting started. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. This is the first in our webinar series. In the past, we had net inclusion in person. For 2021 and 2020, we have a webinar series, which actually allows us to reach more folks. So today we're going to talk about the structural racism behind digital equity, which was a really popular topic last year. So we expect a very rousing discussion amongst our panelists. We're going to ask everyone to use the Q&A for questions and then save the chat for chatter, right? And we do encourage the chatter because we're a community. Quick for those of you who are new to NDIA, we are a community of practitioners and advocates for digital equity. So we are concerned about the affordable access to the internet, the devices, the digital literacy, the tech support, the digital navigation, the things that make our digital world accessible to all of us. So a little bit of housekeeping. Use the chat, as I said, for your chatter. And if you can't hear somebody, let us know in there. The official content for this is about an hour, but we added on an extra 30 minutes to all of our webinars because we want to make sure that there's enough time for Q&A. So our panelists have generously agreed to stick around for a bit, but know that if you have to rush off in an hour, you're going to catch the majority of the content. We are hugely thankful to all of our sponsors for being able to make this happen. That it's, NDIA is a nonprofit. Without the sponsors, none of this would be possible. This is how we pay people. So big thanks to all of our sponsors. We do have one of our sponsors offered to create a virtual reception for us this evening. So that is at 7:30 Eastern, and we'll put the chat for that, or the link for that, in the chat. Everyone is welcome. They have some activities planned to help us be able to connect to each other. One of the things that everyone loves about net inclusion is that it's a space to connect. So that is what we are missing by not being in person. So we're going to do our best to help you connect virtually. Alrighty, Elisa Valentine is our moderator. She works in Commissioner Stark's office at the FCC, and she has generously agreed to moderate this panel for us. And I will turn it over to her to introduce her panelists.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. So again, my name is Elisa Valentine, and I'm thrilled to be with you all here today. One of the first projects I worked on when I was at Public Knowledge was the Discount Internet Guidebook. And that guidebook outlined affordable broadband plans for low-income American households offered by ISPs, and Public Knowledge helped the NDIA team out with that project. And it was really during that time that I started to learn more about the important work that's going on in local communities and that important work that's being led by NDIA as well. So although I'm not at PK anymore, as Angela said, I'm working in the office of FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks as a special advisor. I'm proud to say that I still work closely with the NDIA team to make sure that we're meeting the connectivity needs of low-income communities and communities of color. So thank you so much to Angela and the team at NDIA for making space for this important and timely discussion about broadband access, broadband adoption, and structural racism. So I think we're going to have a great panel discussion here today. So let's go ahead and get things started. We have Chrissy Powell, Rebecca Kauma, James Walker, and Quincy B. I will allow you guys to go ahead and kind of introduce yourselves and your work individually. Let's just kind of begin with a bit of table setting. So if you guys could tell us about your unique roles in the digital inclusion space and how you're really helping to break down structural barriers to ensure that we live in a digitally inclusive world, that would be great. So if we could go ahead and start with Chrissy on this one.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to National Digital Inclusion Alliance for all the work that you continually do, Angela and Sabrina and team. Awesome. Yeah, so I'm Chrissy Powell. I'm the executive director of Bite Back Baltimore. Bite Back is a tech inclusion nonprofit that has been in DC for over 23 years now. And I came on board to expand Bite Back to its first city outside of the DC area, which was Baltimore, which is a highly disconnected city as far as connectivity, but also digital literacy skills. So Bite Back focuses on digital skills training for adults 18 and over. We focus on predominantly Black and Brown communities and neighborhoods with adults who are unemployed and underemployed and live below the federal poverty line. And we really focus on bringing them in, getting them trained in basic computer literacy skills, which we call computer foundations, how to turn on a computer, how to use a mouse, the very, what we call basics of using a computer, and then build up their confidence and get them into, using Microsoft Office, and then into certifications and career opportunities where we do IT certifications and A+ for help desk roles and MOS for administrative roles. So really building up the community through tech training and workforce development. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition, which focuses on a holistic approach to digital inclusion and access through connectivity, device access, digital literacy, skills training, tech support, and advocacy. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Chrissy. So now we're gonna go over to the West Coast. Rebecca?
Thank you so much, Elisa. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from California. And I'm actually working out of Los Angeles, but I work for the city of Long Beach. And again, my name is Rebecca Cullum, and I'm the Economic and Digital Program Manager for the city of Long Beach. And for me, I'm just super excited to be part of this panel because I really like talking about the intersection between digital inclusion and racial equity. And that is essentially the essence of the work that I do for the city of Long Beach. So Long Beach is a very diverse city. We are oftentimes praised for our diversity and all of the rich culture that we have. But with that does come a lot of deep roots of racism, both systemically, institutionally, and also individually. So for us, it's very important to understand the why behind the racism and to truly incorporate racial equity as part of our work. So for us here in Long Beach, we have an Office of Equity, and we have also taken a lot of strides to be able to address the inequities that exist in our systems and institutions. And that also includes uplifting the work of the digital divide and ultimately addressing it through digital inclusion. So I'm super excited to share a little bit more about how we have been able to intentionally apply a racial equity lens to our work.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. Now I'm going to turn things over to James. Tell us a little bit about your work and what you do.
Thank you. I'm James, and I'm the CEO of Informative Technologies. We're a social venture that's based in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've been a partner since our founding 7 years ago of UNC Charlotte. So we have access to great academics as well as engineering and computer science students. We have speaking of system, I guess we could say we're a systematic solutions provider. We're looking at how do we work with the healthcare system, how do we work with social service systems, educational systems, and look at where their gaps are, particularly in underserved communities, and help architect the platforms that they need in order to achieve equity and their equity goals. So we worked with the library system, for example, in a CARES Act that reached grant that reached 2,000 households with computers that we train people from marginalized backgrounds to refurbish and provide digital navigation for. We also are working with the Public Health Department for a release as soon as next Monday of an app that is going to help about 450 families across 50 Black churches get evidence-based recommendations on how to stay active and fit. So having a shot is one thing, but eating right, exercising, building resilience to reduce the health inequities we are in this pandemic, that's part of the work that we do. So our goal is that we are helping upskill people from workforce innovation grant programs, from local job boards, the Urban League, and Goodwill, and get those same people to be able to get their first IT job in connecting their community in whatever way they want. If they want to learn coding to help us on a coding project, or they want to do networking or computer engineering to help us with those aspects as well. So we have a very circular approach to everything that we're doing. And our goal is that our lens is that we understand our communities best because we have a diverse team, but we look forward to having solutions at the end of the day, measurable solutions that have moved the needle. And so that's what we hope to be able to do as we partner with the nonprofit and the public sector.
Great, thank you so much, James. And last but not least, we have Quincy B from Erase the Red Line.
So I'm Quincy, founder and director of Erase the Red Line Incorporated, which is best described as a community-based capacity building organization. And the skills and activities there range from assisting grassroots organization provide power banks to unhoused populations, to the more statewide and national work of actually trying to increase digital inclusion practitioners throughout the field of social work and in different professions, actually helping other organizations get a better understanding of how we can focus on social determinants of health, but we also need to focus on the political determinants of health to kind of help people understand better ways to incorporate other activities into the work that they're already doing and explore what activities they're already doing to kind of diversify their funding streams from grassroots organizations to, again, national organizations.
Great, thank you all so much. So Rebecca and Quincy, I'm actually going to turn things over to you. So let's kind of discuss how it is that we got here. Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities are less likely to have a home broadband connection than their white counterparts, while also living in mobile-only households. So we're all dependent on access to the internet, as we know, especially during this pandemic, for education, healthcare, and work. And yet there are millions of people across this country who do not have a home broadband connection. So Rebecca, if you were to kind of draw a timeline or a diagram to really help us understand what mistakes we made to get to this point, what would that look like?
Sure, thank you. That is a very, very good question. I think the most important thing for us to first and foremost understand is the history of this country. So I would say most people on this Zoom call would know, but I think it's important for people to understand how our country was founded on institutional and systemic racism and oppression. And the government has played a significant role in creating and maintaining those racial inequities. And a perfect example of this is redlining. And the federal government, through redlining, was able to systematically deny resources to Black communities. And the reason why it's important for us to call out redlining is that redlining transformed explicit racism into systemic racism. And through redlining, we are still able to see those implications of that even till today. So for example, we are able to see where racial inequities exist across all of our different systems, whether it's education, health, economics, and even in housing. And for us here in Long Beach, it's important for us to understand and to look at the data. So for example, here in the city of Long Beach, we understand that Black residents have the lowest rates of home ownership. And the most important thing for us to understand is that was not by accident. It's very easy for people to make an assumption and say that, oh, you know, Black/African Americans have the lowest rates of home ownership because maybe they just prefer to live in apartments. But when we look at the root causes and unpack all of the systemic and institutional racism, oppression, almost like an onion, you'll be able to see that the root cause of this is behind redlining. And ultimately, all of these different inequities that exist ultimately tie into how we see digital inequities as well. So for us to truly advance digital inclusion in our work, we must first and foremost acknowledge the root causes that exist in digital inequities. And we can do that by conducting a root cause analysis. So for us here in the city of Long Beach, we work closely with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And that is an organization that helps us work closely with our community and intentionally apply racial equity to our work by understanding why certain communities are disproportionately affected by inequities, and also looking to see how we can incorporate racial equity to be able to address those inequities and root causes. So for us, we must intentionally understand the why behind why communities don't have access and equitable access to the internet and computers. And by having that essential understanding and foundation will ultimately better drive our digital equity and inclusion efforts.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. And Quincy, do you have anything to add to that?
Almost no. That was a great that was a great answer, Rebecca, on redlining. So even more simply put, looking at equity indexes and really understanding how this idea or this theory of mutual causality actually occurs in community and how one thing leads to another. So a household without adequate access to resources is less likely to not only obtain those resources, but they're more likely to have a lower level of educational attainment, right? And as time goes on, that household with lower educational attainment is going to not be able to gain access to the economy or jobs with higher paying income that further reduces their ability to acquire different resources. And that cycle kind of continues. So that's at the kind of the household level. But then when you look at the instability of a household, if the head of household and the many head of households aren't stable within a community, then you have instability at the community level, right? So if individuals at the community level aren't able to obtain education or obtain resources to, maybe start businesses or do different things into their community, or make the income that actually feeds the tax base of their community, then that community is unstable. And then if you have a bunch of those communities within a municipality that are unstable, you end up with a lower tax base for that municipality. And then that trickles upwards as you start to look at the household level, up to the municipal level, up to the county level, up to the state level. And then when drilling back down and looking at certain things, because of all these ideas and all these variables of things working against each other in households, when you get up to the municipal level or you get up to the county level, it gets a little bit harder to understand what's going on at the community level, because you're looking at such a large scale that you actually may be missing the individuals who are the most vulnerable, because you're looking at it from a larger perspective and a larger point of view, because you're not drilling down to those census tract levels in those more vulnerable households. So upstream and downstream, inequality and vulnerabilities affect the whole community and it affects the whole state. But it's just about what tools we're going to use to actually infuse resources into those communities. And later we'll talk about some great ideas to do some of those things, but that's all I have.
Great, thank you so much, Quincy. So let's go over to Chrissy. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of merging racial equity solutions and digital equity work in your local community?
Yeah, sure, of course. It's interesting because with connectivity, you often hear about rural broadband. And, the big question mark comes, well, what about if we are in an urban city? Like Baltimore, which is predominantly Black and African-American residents. We're often left out of the conversation even. So I just want to bring it to, like you said, local community. In a city like Baltimore, it is lack of infrastructure, but also affordability. And, Quincy spoke to that problem really with education and with being able to make a sustainable living wage in a household to be able to afford something like the internet. So we're looking at, for our local community in Baltimore, we're looking at two things. We're looking at the lack of infrastructure, which really is aligned with the systemic racism that Rebecca was mentioning. There were certain neighborhoods that actually do not have the infrastructure and was intentionally overlooked, if you will, in which they cannot connect to the internet. So we have the infrastructure piece that is, I feel like we'll get to later, is finally being addressed. But then the affordability piece is a huge gap, really. And in our community in Baltimore and communities across the nation, workforce development is really at the core of bridging racial equity and even digital equity, which is really in so many ways one and the same. So I want to take a moment just to talk about, nonprofits and workforce training programs that will get our Black and Brown residents who have not been afforded the opportunity, the resources, nor the education to be able to get into living wage careers, giving them the training opportunity to be upskilled and to gain the skills needed to be able to enter living wage careers and to be able to support their families and also afford what was once a luxury of internet connectivity and devices in their home. For my organization, our organization Bite Back, the real focus is those living wage careers. So being able to bring in adults and, as I mentioned earlier, starting them at the very foundations of how to use a computer. We know that even frontline workers, grocery store workers, whether we're talking retail, manufacturing, construction, they all require digital skills. And to be able to get the job, to be able to maintain the job and do the training, you have to have these, what we call basic digital literacy skills. So for Bite Back, it was such an honor to bring this direct service, free direct service to the community members to be able to gain foundational digital literacy skills. And once they obtain that, then of course they could go in and get an entry level job, but the goal is to build them up and to build their skills to be able to go into our certification programs, to go into IT, entry level IT as a help desk technician, for instance. The IT industry in Baltimore and in many cities across the nation is continually growing. The digital economy is growing and opportunities to diversify the tech industry is growing. We have the talent in Baltimore. We have a talented group of residents that are eager and hungry, just waiting for the opportunity and the resources to get the skills to be able to fill those positions. So I really wanted to, everybody to take a moment and to be sure to, look into the local workforce training organizations, specifically the ones that are training in tech. I know it was mentioned earlier about programs, that coding and software development, and as well as, help desk, but also really focusing on those foundation, those basic digital literacy skills. We have to acknowledge and really target that first. And get everybody to the point where they can go into a certification program and programs that do not require a college education. So programs like Bite Back will allow a resident who has not been afforded the opportunity to go to college to get certifications, industry recognized certifications, and into a living wage career without the debt of a college education.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Yes, I definitely think it's important that we have those discussions more about the ways in which the economy and closing a digital divide are closely linked. But we first have to recognize those who are being, left out of the digital economy. So, Rebecca, I want to turn things over to you. You kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you provide some concrete examples of the ways in which you and your organization are kind of merging the worlds of racial equity and digital equity in your work?
Sure, thank you so much. And I think it's important for us to understand what is the definition of racial equity. So for us in the city of Long Beach, we have adopted the Government Alliance on Race and Equity's definition. So for them, they define racial equity as when race can no longer be used to predict life's outcomes. And we understand that when we look at the data and disaggregate it by race, socioeconomic status, language, that it's communities of color that are disproportionately affected by the digital divide. And so when we're looking at racial equity, it allows us to prioritize communities that are most in need by explicitly but not exclusively focusing on race. And racial equity does not take a one-size-fits-all approach. So for example, here in Long Beach, we have the largest Cambodian population outside of Cambodia. So the Cambodian community would require different resources and services than the Black/African American community. And we need to acknowledge that all communities have different challenges, barriers, and lived experiences. And with that in mind, we must be very thoughtful and inclusive with how we approach all communities in our decisions, policies, practices, and programs. So for us, we work closely by applying a racial equity lens by asking simple racial equity questions as part of our work. So for example, with the toolkit that we use from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, it includes certain questions that you should be implementing early on when you're in the process of either developing, implementing, or evaluating the different types of efforts that you're working on. And some of those questions include, with the program that you're developing, will this community be disproportionately burdened or affected? Have you disaggregated data to see which communities are most impacted by this particular issue? Have you engaged with communities most impacted? So those are all essential questions that you should be asking while you're implementing your different types of efforts and are all part of that racial equity toolkit. And another thing that I want to mention as well is that community ownership is the key. So as a government leader, I understand that the government has a lot of mistrust and distrust that we have to work through. And even today, as we're developing different strategies, they all need to be done in alignment and co-collaborated with the community. If you don't have community ownership while you're implementing racial equity efforts and digital inclusion, then you're essentially perpetuating the current inequities that are existing. So I'll definitely post the toolkit that I'm referencing so other cities and jurisdictions and entities can apply that to their work.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. So let's kind of look at this now from kind of a macro approach. So Chrissy, and I'll actually open this up to the rest of the panelists as well in case you all want to answer as well, because I think we have the time. Are there any digital inclusion solutions that have been implemented specifically during the pandemic on the state level or on the national level that you believe will really help close the racial digital divide in this country? And Chrissy, I'll let you start.
Yeah. So there have been, and not quick enough, as many of us, will say, money has been allocated throughout the pandemic, but has it reached the community? And thus far in Baltimore, I can say that little have resources. When I say resources, I mean money, because it takes money to get things done. It takes money to connect the community. And the resources just have not been seen as I believe they could have been at a local level. However, I would say that the tide is turning a bit. We have the EBB benefits, which is the emergency broadband benefits, that really is rolling out, hopefully, at the end of this month. There is not an exact date yet, but the EBB benefits really will provide the opportunity for low-income residents to get connected to the internet. So that is, I think, an exciting opportunity to explore. We don't know how long that's going to last, if that's, until the funding runs out. So who knows, we might have 6 months to really get the word out to our community members through the Digital Navigators program, for instance, which is a national initiative that is really going to bridge that gap between government really and community. I think one of the biggest challenges we have here that Rebecca mentioned is building the trust in the community. Getting the trust of the community, rather. And with the digital navigators, that really creates an opportunity for community members to knock on doors, to go, to churches and gatherings and really, educate community members on the need for internet, the need for connectivity, and the need for digital skills and tech supports, because many community members they simply don't know. They have not been educated. They've been left out of the conversation. So I'm excited about the EBB benefits, the Digital Navigators program. For Maryland, Governor Hogan actually allocated close to $300 million from the American Rescue Plan funds to digital equity, which is really, I think, amazing. So I want to applaud our Governor Hogan, for doing that. A big bulk of that is actually going to physical infrastructure. So around 160 million or so of that is going towards physical infrastructure. So we're talking broadband infrastructure and deployment, which is huge. That is huge, especially for our disconnected communities, both rural and urban communities. And then a chunk of that also goes to affordability, as well as, providing subsidized funds for our monthly broadband service fees. A small amount of it is going towards digital skills training, which is inclusive of the Digital Navigators program, as well as a digital inclusion fund. It's 8 million for the state of Maryland, which my hope is that this is phase one, that the chunk of this is going towards infrastructure. But let's not forget that we can put the infrastructure in place, but if the residents do not have the knowledge and confidence to use a computer, it's really for nothing. So we can put the infrastructure in place. We can get devices out there, which is also included in this fund and in this plan. But I am a little disappointed, if you will, that it's such a small amount allocated to digital skills training and training our community members on how to use a computer, truly. So like I said, I'm hoping there'll be a phase two once the infrastructure is in place, once the devices are in place, that there will be a huge amount of resources allocated to digital skills training and tech supports for our residents. So those are just a few things that are very recent that I'm excited about and hope will continue to develop and scale as we move past the pandemic.
Great. Thank you so much, Chrissy. And just for the audience members out there, I do want to make a shameless plug here. Please visit fcc.gov/broadband benefit if you're interested in becoming an outreach partner. It's going to be really important that we get the word out about the emergency broadband benefit. As you guys may know, the Lifeline program, our participation rate often sits at around 20%. We really want the emergency broadband benefit program to be successful. So please sign up to be an outreach partner. All right, I'm going to turn things over to James. You've talked in our conversations in the past about apprenticeship funding and models that will help underserved communities. So can you talk a little bit more about your experience?
Yes, our focus is that our own community members in our target communities will be able to maintain what we deploy there. And that means that there's going to be an educational component, and that is something that we've done for about 6 of the 7 years that we've been in existence, working with the Workforce Development Board of the county around Charlotte, Mecklenburg County. There has since the 80s been a workforce innovation and opportunity program, investment program, which basically says instead of paying people constantly unemployment insurance because they can't hold down a job, why not just pay them to get training? And if they can just find a work site, the person will be paid, and the work site gets to have affordable sources of labor, but there's protections involved for both the work site and the worker. But the person comes unskilled, and now you have your work to do in training it. I've taken that program, and that becomes the source of probably 90% of my workforce. I do thousands of hours of those internships a year, and we work on complicated projects that involve working with our graduate students, who tend to also be people of color here at the university, who are collaborating with people who are technically unskilled, but who know their communities really well. And we allow them to collaborate together and make sure that the voice of the community is really represented in how we code a solution, how we deploy, how do we create support documentation if they're bilingual, making sure everything that we do is bilingual, and basically taking a program that oftentimes is just used to get people to be stock room employees or folks that put products on shelves, and we take that program and turn it into an upskilling engine. Because what happens when you take away the risk of loss, if I have to pay $10 to $15 an hour for someone who has no skills and have a client with a project that expects things to be done in a certain way, it's just too expensive. I'm going to have to pick somebody who already has done this before. But if you take away the costs as a business owner of getting the building up a workforce, right, then I can be more forgiving of them. And they realize they have a golden opportunity here to work at a university, with a startup, with major civic organizations as their clients. And something interesting happens, by the way. I have these tend to be people who have a disciplinary problem in their past. They might have had a prison record, or they might have been a student that had a juvenile record, or whatever it might be. Almost no disciplinary problems in 7 years. No outbursts, not so much as a curse word, because people realize, well, you're giving me a shot. So when you take those programs seriously, and again, you have the cultural competency to see these as individuals, not as troubled people, not even as marginalized or at-risk youth, they rise to the challenge. And I move very fast. Everybody learns how to take apart a computer to its screws verbally with no notes and put it back together in the first 2 hours. And I do it in front of them in like 10 minutes. And then they realize, wow, 2 hours is actually a lot of time. They realize that at the end of the day, they could do something that they thought was the scariest thing, and I can talk them through it. And that means if you can do that, imagine what we'll do this semester. And I think in those programs, which certainly I'm thankful for, that we have people like Chrissy focusing on the workforce aspect of this. I think that we can create a workforce that is going to be able to be enriched by these millions of dollars if we approach it the right way. That's one of the things that we're working with the NDIA and NDIA affiliates on, is how do we do that technical training? Call them civic technicians. They understand Linux, they understand how to refurbish, they understand how to set up a network and configure the 90% of the things that you're going to get a call about if you build, say, a community ISP or rolled out thousands of computers. And they can at least provide that on-site, boots on the ground support, which makes a lot of things that are often funded through good intentions, infrastructure that in a decade is rotting on the vine, and it becomes blighted infrastructure in a low-income community. So that's our approach. And I think that one of the other things that we do is we, of course, have a really strong mentorship angle. So one thing that I guess disappoints me, about the opportunity when we're talking about this kind of racial reckoning is that we don't talk a lot about the Reconstruction era up to maybe the Great Depression, when we had, as Quincy really well pointed out, redlining. We had obviously no civil rights. We had lynchings that were not prosecuted, and yet African Americans as a race, if you wanted to call that, had a choice of 200 Black hospitals, up to, according to the Federal Reserve at the height, 134 different Black banks. And if they can get into a college, they have their choice of 121 Black colleges and universities. So we're, obviously, Latino experience is different than African American and Black experience, but certainly when we talk about ourselves, we sometimes think of just marginalized, we have nothing to kind of bring to the table. Our grandparents lived in a world that with no rights, nothing else, that did not stop them. If we now have rights and we have people of goodwill of all ethnicities coming together, and we have internet and we have freedom of communication, and now we have federal funding too, what kind of infrastructure could we build for our own communities today and maintain? Could we build our own ISPs? Can we build our own technology companies? Of course we can. And it's happening globally. And if we look at this as an impact investment, the same way we would see investing in Nigeria or in Kenya, in the Silicon Savannah, we're investing in that same kind of innovative people. And it's not just throwaways to people who don't really know how to do anything for themselves. Then I think you're going to see that same rise on a mass scale of that light bulb going off and like, yeah, I could take a thing to its screws and build it up. I've never even had a computer at home, but now I have the energy again. And I hope that our message is not only what people have done in the past that was wrong, but what people helped us do and what we did within ourselves and our communities just 2 generations ago. That was amazing. And that lasts to this day. So that's part of the core of how we mentor and produce thousands of hours of person hours of productivity when they realize kind of that bigger story that they're a part of.
Thank you so much, James. So in that same vein, like talking about progress, right? Quincy, let's keep in the back of our minds that there will obviously always be new technologies, there will be new challenges, and there will also be a greater dependence on connectivity, 10 years from now. So how can we measure that we've made significant progress in closing a digital divide if it's year 2031?
So I think a couple different things are occurring like right now in some of these spaces. Academia, for instance, the likelihood that you're going to get a large grant and still be able to call yourself a anchor institution without having community support and real engagement with community isn't going to fly for too much longer, right? While we're seeing the influx of information become available, you're also seeing certification programs become available from different organizations. Grow with Google, for instance, Microsoft offering certain certifications, for instance. So individuals who are able to be connected in communities with, I guess, private organizations that are starting to understand, hold on, there's money out here for CTE and mentorship and upskilling of our current staff. Because as someone who's like operated a mental health and substance use facility, it's not really the easiest to get some more seasoned therapists to transition from paper charts to electronic charts, right? So as we're starting to realize in our organizations that it's a new wave, and we have to be a lot more diverse, not just in the way that we look, but the skills that are being available. We're going to have to change things. There's also many underutilized funds that come down institutionally or from the state level. Many organizations don't know that they qualify for certain investment dollars from like the Department of Labor for employee upskilling. Many individuals didn't know that there were ways for them to get half of their employees' salary paid through using apprenticeship programs. And now I'm starting to see grassroots organizations actually ask me for data, things that they used to stay away from before, right? And seeing them kind of see even grassroots organizations without much funding step their game up to say, okay, we're doing the same thing some of these larger organizations are doing, but we just haven't been tracking it and measuring it, because now as we're seeing funding coming out, different types of organizations are able to qualify for these fundings. So you have different size organizations talking to each other, and you have students in these facilities and in these universities that used to just be really passive with some of the oppression that we were seeing in academia, saying like, no, we're supposed to be social workers, so we're going to talk about racism, and let's talk about the foundation of racism, and let's say social work, right? Because not everyone, but certain people want to say defund the police, and then other people are saying, hold on, are we going to take care of the racism that exists within the field of social work first before we take this money from over here, put it over here, and people are in the same situation, just in a different facility or a different environment. So seeing and hearing some of those conversations occur at levels that I haven't seen them occur before shows me that there's going to be some progress somewhere. And we're just going to have to incorporate different activities into things. Like I've submitted proposals in 2019 that I'm getting calls about now to come in and do facility presentations. And I'm like, what changed between 2019 and now, right? There's a few things that have changed, but I think we are starting to see things a little bit differently.
Thank you so much, Quincy. And does anyone else want to answer that question? How will we measure that we've made progress in closing a digital divide if we're in year 2031?
Yeah, I'd like to chip in. If we, and I love that Rebecca had that way of articulating racial equity. If we say that race doesn't become a predictor I think that is a really good way of thinking of it. Right now, Pew Research Institute has the phenomenally simple, but it's elegant in its simplicity report on the demographics of device ownership, asking a basic question: do you own one of the following: laptop, desktop, tablet, ebook reader, smartwatch in your home? And African Americans, the first year they did it in 2015, only 45% said yes, I have a laptop or desktop. And I think they did it a year or two ago, right before the pandemic, and it was like, okay, 55%. So it moved up 10%. But this is like the 21st century in the 2020s. Simply breaking the numbers out by ethnicity, you can just see it's highly predictable. That should not happen, right? If we can get to a point where in a community, our infrastructure is such that you couldn't tell that this is a Black neighborhood or a white neighborhood just by looking at how many people have access to broadband. Right now, we all know the FCC's data allows you to overlay that data with census tracts, and the same census tracts are the same census tracts that are majority minority. So if we can use that as a strong goal in a decade's time, where we can't use racial data to predict connectivity data, because we're talking about technology here after all, not skin tone, then I think that is the ultimate goal that we should be going at. And if our spending is wise, it should move that needle, and it can do so methodically. If our spending is well-intentioned but not really going anywhere, I think it's going to be that ultimately at the end of the project, the same number, we didn't really address enough households to move away from making it so that I could still predict the composure of the neighborhood and the connectivity of the neighborhood. So just hard, fast, data-driven analytics on what was the outcome of the project would be my recommendation.
And I do just briefly want to say, I think it's important also that we have movements or collective impact models like the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition and various coalitions in different cities that have been formed pre-COVID, but have also formed, during this pandemic, that really hold a city and government officials and these large ISPs accountable, so that they are really representing community and community members and have they don't have any other investment, should I say, but the investment of the community and the community members. So I really think it's important that if a city or town does not have a collective impact model, that be something that you all potentially look to establishing that is inclusive of especially the nonprofits, the community-based organizations, the workforce development organizations, the K through 12 players, the church leaders, and even inclusive of the funders, the local funders as well, is all important because it requires resources, of course. But to have that body of organizations that have this unified goal of bridging and closing the digital divide has been beyond impactful. In Baltimore, the coalition's only been around since March of last year, but I mean, things have moved that had not moved before, and just that collective impact, togetherness, that collaborative, creative, brains and minds and passions coming together, and bridging that gap and creating a community voice, I think is something that is needed in all cities, in all communities. And just to bounce off of really quick what James had mentioned earlier, community-run ISPs is something that has really taken off. And I know for our city in Baltimore, we have Rowdy Orbit and Project Waves, which are two community-run ISPs, and that really focus on hiring community members to build mesh networks in the most disconnected neighborhoods throughout the city, providing free internet access to residents. So there's just so many different opportunities, and I think that come within the creative thinking and of that collective impact coalition model. So I just wanted to express that, to kind of put something on the to-do list potentially.
And also just to follow up on what James said, that surveying of who has what is extremely important. Even looking at that American Community Survey, right? If you're asking someone whether or not they have access to something, it's not the same as asking them if they own something, if it's theirs, if they have it in their household. Because what happens when that small amount of individuals who are being surveyed for the American Community Survey are actually doing that survey, let's just say in March when they have access, but it's because it's coming from their children's school. And then in the summertime, they don't have that access. All those other resources and information that's attached to that device goes away. And we should really, in my opinion, start talking not just about the digital divide, but the information divide, and how individuals aren't able to get access to information and resources that are like definitely needed within communities. And then our solution for everything, mental health, substance abuse, is to do telehealth and throw everything online without realizing that the people who may need these things the most don't have access to these devices, and may not know how to use these devices, right? So looking at those things on a continuum to say, hey, if we're thinking about putting all this information out there and we only have two methods of doing it, whether it's digitally or sending out mailers, but we know why impoverished census tracts are hard to count is because they don't open their mail. And that's one of the indicators of someone missing some of this information or these resources. We have to be more intentional with actually focusing on equity and ownership and paying attention to what individuals have versus what they don't have. And then actually, being unapologetic about talking about why people don't have it and holding electeds accountable for ensuring that certain people still don't have things.
Thank you so much. So it is 1:55, so that ends our official 1 hour webinar. Our panelists have agreed, as Angela said earlier, to stay on for 30 minutes to answer more questions. So please use the Q&A function on here to ask your questions and not the chat. I see there's a lot of movement in the chat, which we love and appreciate, but if you have a question for the panelists, please put it in the Q&A. And also, as we stated earlier, everyone is welcome to join the Net Inclusion virtual reception sponsored by Partners Bridging a Digital Divide tonight at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm sure our NDIA folks are going to be putting that in the chat again for everyone to register. So please be sure to attend that tonight at 7:30. And also, Net Inclusion webinars are scheduled for 1 p.m. Eastern through May. We have a link that folks will put in here as well. They'll be added to the chat for those webinars. So let's go ahead and get some more questions in here. I'm going to click on this Q&A. So we heard folks talk about digital equity throughout this, but do you all kind of have a different way that you define digital equality versus digital equity? And what are kind of the differences between those? And I'm opening this up to whichever panelist would love to answer.
I have a really drawn out answer for that, and I won't make it drawn out. I'll just say that I look at digital inclusion on a continuum, right? From zero, having no access to those resources, or people who have access to those resources, to being on the other end of the spectrum, fully integrated with updated systems and the ability to use all of those systems. Individuals are going to fall somewhere on that continuum and always can have growth and always can be upskilled, which means that anybody that you are presented with or anybody that you look at have the potential to increase those skills, which then increases the opportunity to actually teach more and get people more integrated into things, regardless of which end of the spectrum they're on, because we have evolving technologies and we have new things coming out all the time. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I'll chime in as well. So for me, I personally don't like the word equality, just because it doesn't recognize the differences and lived experiences of communities. So when looking at equity and then also equality, equality means you're treating everybody the same. And then when you're looking at equity, it focuses on you treating people based on fairness. And we've been able to see that by focusing on equality. And if you guys are very familiar with the equity chart where it shows the three individuals who all have the same boxes, and then the other three who don't have the same, who have different level of boxes to meet their needs, you can see that by focusing on equity, it truly does allow us to tailor to the unique needs of communities, as I expressed earlier before. So I think we need to start shifting from equality now to equity, and that will allow us to really focus on the communities that have been disproportionately affected by the digital divide. And I think that right now, especially as Quincy mentioned, we've been seeing a lot of organizations who have been wanting to get involved in racial justice. When we were seeing the civil uprising over the summer, I literally got so many alerts on my phone from organizations that I forgot that I subscribed to, saying that, oh, we're committed to racial justice, oh, we're committed to equity. And then you look at all the other indicators, and that does not seem to, show as a way that they're committed to those particular issues. So I think that's important for us to uplift equity, and then those who also focus on that to call them out if they're not truly looking at it from that particular perspective.
Great, thank you so much. So Chrissy, we have a question here about Baltimore. So how has Johns Hopkins impacted the accessibility of resources for non-white residents, whether it be in a positive way or negative or neutral?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't represent everybody, the entire city's opinion of Johns Hopkins. I do know that the university, actually Johns Hopkins University's 21st Century Cities Initiative, recently put out a report around achieving digital equity in Baltimore. I'll actually put that in the chat. And they, let me drop that in the chat right now so you all can take a look at that. But yes, in this report, I think they really hit on matters regarding digital equity. They, consulted many of the community organization members, including the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition, as they were writing this report. So I did appreciate that. However, we know, as with many, research institutes, they eat up a lot of money and have a lot of resources. And, in speaking with my colleague recently, he had mentioned how Hopkins, buys up distressed neighborhoods and they revitalize them in the city, but not to the benefit of the city residents, not to the benefit of those who are without. So our Black and most predominantly Black and African-American community members. So, and of course, as far as Hopkins, when we look at the student body and the leadership and the staff, it's predominantly white. So I think that many would argue that, Hopkins has a long way to go as far as diversity and including Black residents in their plans and when they do their strategic planning and community efforts. I do know with reports like this, they are definitely beneficial. They really, I think, target those decision makers who are predominantly white, decision makers. I think it's a benefit, but I do think that there's a lot more that can be done. Hopkins, I know, like I said, my colleague mentioned Henrietta Lacks about literally like taking ideas and stealing ideas, from Black people and making money off of them. So I think there's a lot of work to be done for Hopkins to really gain the trust of community and community members. I should say that we recently had a diversity in tech career fair in which Hopkins did donate an offer for us, for the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition and the Baltimore Tracks Coalition, to utilize their Brazen platform for this virtual career fair. So, little by little, I feel like progress is happening, but I mean, it's just, Hopkins goes back so far, and just historically, as far as systemic racism, I mean, there is a lot there that I'm sure that, I still have to learn and to know, but that's, I don't know if anybody else, wants to chime in there, but that's really kind of my lens on the role that Hopkins has played and is playing currently in the Baltimore community. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you so much. So we have a question here, I think is great. Why do you all think that communities of color that live in urban areas specifically are not connecting to home broadband when the infrastructure is there and when it is affordable, such as through, internet essentials and the various other kind of discount internet offers that exist? James?
One of the things that I've noticed, because this is something that we work with our community partners on, with any project, you want to make sure that it's being adopted. And oftentimes, I mentioned one light bulb moment from the workforce side, right? Like, you just never seen other people creating things with technology. You've seen people posting stuff on social media or whatever, or making music, but you don't know this whole other world. And when someone explains it to you in a way that you understand and is respectful of your perspective, the light bulb goes off and they sink in, they dig in. I think the same thing happens when we're in a community. So if I, for example, said that if I told you in 2019, in 2020, you will either be furloughed because you don't have technology in the home, or you could be fired. So in other words, you can work remotely or you won't be working. If a population heard that, they would do something about it. It would not be seen as nice to have, right? Or they would, if they can't afford it, they would go to their community organizations or politicians and they would say, do something so I'm prepared for that. Well, we've been saying that, all of us, all of our advocacy groups are saying, this is like the 21st century, you can't compete effectively. But here it became dire. And we saw the massive impact it had on communities of color, right? If I told businesses, it's not just nice to have a barbershop and you have no website, you have no checkout system, it's just a guy with, swiping stuff or doing Cash App in a barber stool chair, like it's the 1980s. You can't do that because stuff is going to shut down. You have to make reservations. You have to be ready in the future, which is going to be 2020, the year 2019. Again, if that was convinced enough to them, they would prepare for that reality. We've been trying to prepare for that. Now the reality is hit, right? 80% of Black businesses fail within a year and a half from now to a year and a half from now, ago. 80% have failed, or they just become little side hustles because they don't know how to do business online because their strip mall is closed for a year at end. So I think when we make the terms really clear, you're losing out if you don't have access to these resources. You're not using these resources, and if you're using them, you're not using them at a higher and higher level and growing in your knowledge because other people are. Then what ends up happening is the only way they know about technology is what they see at Walmart or Best Buy or wherever you buy technology, which is squeezed between the Xboxes and the PlayStations and really expensive TVs is yet another laptop. So that makes me think that a laptop is among the other things that I use to entertain myself. Like a TV, I just use YouTube and Hulu. And that becomes a thing that I've seen, at least in Charlotte, as a mindset change. Whoa, wait, I'm holding myself back from being more competitive. I'm holding my kids back from being more competitive academically, not having this. I'm woke now. I want to make sure that other people are woke. When you convey that thing in the words that fit for your community, wherever you are, that's when I see them wake up and they realize we have to do something about it. It is not just like I choose not to have satellite, I have cable. It is something that is essential for me to have anywhere near equity. So that's an approach that I've found to be relevant in our experiences here in our work.
I also think we in general in society underestimate the extent to which trust plays into whether or not someone's going to adopt things. I'll speak from my own personal perspective. Even though I'm me, no matter where I am, I still have the same level of education. I still have the same ownership. I still have the same equity. But how I present myself is going to make a difference between whether or not somebody is trusting me at that particular point in time. Even going into a community of individuals that look like me, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to trust me with the information that I'm providing them. I also think that there has to be the perfect amount of information provided to individuals when you're trying to get them to adopt something, like the Goldilocks approach. Sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little. And I think we also have to be armed with answers to particular questions. And we also, as practitioners, have to, be a little bit more comfortable telling people we don't know and we don't have the answers to particular things. Talking about EBB and trying to get different organizations to understand how beneficial that temporary access will be in their communities. You also engage in that conversation with, okay, we get people signed up, we get them onboarded, and then what? What happens? Are we going to lose our human capital and our social capital and our political capital with those individuals that we're providing access to? And are we going to be viewed as another one of those who comes in, swoops in, does something, especially in New Jersey right now, because it's an election year, and depending on your political affiliation, and may be viewed as something that's just temporary because we're trying to get something else out of it instead of doing what we really want to do and transfer the equity downstream. So I think it's a mixed bag, and trust is really important on all different levels.
That's right. And just to add to that, what happens when the EBB benefits, when the funds run out? So, we're setting folks up with, connectivity, but when it runs out, are they going to be left with a bill? Are they going to be left with figuring out how to pay this on their own? So there's a lot of questions as to, yeah, this is great as a temporary solution, but what's happening in the long term? And is it going to be another scenario where, once again, we lose the trust that we're just learning to gain from the community members because we don't look at the long-term solutions? So what is the plan after these funds run out, or once EBB, who knows what's going to happen with it? So how do we support community members with what's next and what to do, after the government comes in as a savior to provide this, and it's no longer accessible?
So thank you for that. I'm actually, I can put this in the chat here for people to read more about it. But with the order that we adopted in February, we did make a promise that in advance of like the final month subsidy would be no less than 50% of the standard amount. So that's like kind of a fine start there, but I'll put that information in the chat here, not the Q&A. Let me make sure
Awesome. And while you do that, I also wanted to add the responsibility of our local businesses and our universities and hospitals and research institutions, since we mentioned Johns Hopkins, the responsibility of providing employment and opening their doors around, diverse, more specifically, Black community members, and opening their doors of employment to community members filling those positions and even being priority to filling open positions. I think with institutions, and I'm referring back to Hopkins because that was mentioned, you see the janitors and those working in, food and beverage, predominantly, Black and brown community members. And these are, low wage positions, but those are, I would say, for the most part, when you go into Hopkins or University of Maryland, those entry level workers are Black African American residents. So how can they invest in upskilling their workers and training their workers to be able to get promotions and to move up into higher wage positions? So I would also call on our for Baltimore, we have a lot of universities. We have Hopkins, we have University of Maryland, medical systems, which are huge, and they have the opportunity to be able to afford these positions to our residents. So I'd ask that they really get involved in the conversation around hiring, around what we call diversity and inclusion, and partnering with those community organizations, those workforce development organizations, and recruiting for their positions.
Great, thank you so much. And I did drop that information from Commissioner Stark's statement on the emergency broadband benefit. If you scroll to the third page, the commissioner talked about the importance of like the request that he made, which was an opt-in approach for partial discounts in which households would have to affirmatively consent to kind of continuing their service at the end of the emergency broadband benefit program. But I do think, Chrissy, that is a really important point about how we even outreach materials that the FCC works on. Like, we need to make sure that people in the community are able to answer those questions. I definitely agree with what you all said about the importance of trust as well, because it's kind of weird if someone shows up at your house and they're like, hey, here's this free internet, right? Like how many of us would kind of trust that. And kind of on that same note, I want to kind of shift the conversation to that of privacy. How many of you all are working on kind of digital literacy and digital equity efforts that are focused on privacy rights? A lot of people are concerned about how their data is collected or how their data is stored and shared and sold. So what are you all doing in that realm as relates to privacy and surveillance? And this is open to anyone who wants to answer.
I'll just briefly say that in ours, because we're coming from the solutions architecture side, so we're building out things, people get grant money, or we're helping them understand there's grant money on the table that will evaporate if you don't know about it, and we can work together with you to scale up a solution. We are very strong advocates for open source software, which it's not just that it's free stuff, it's that you can see how the code works and you can see what it's up to. If I needed to inspect it. We use Linux on our deployments. Linux is what Chrome OS is. Linux is what Android OS is. Linux runs Zoom and all of the other stuff that's in the cloud right now. 90% of the websites on the world run on that kind of operating system, and it's rock steady, it's solid, it's privacy oriented. When we have the issue of, say, community broadband, which is something that we also help communities understand how to support and build for themselves. If you have a public Wi-Fi, then what we point out to them is you should have a VPN solution. So Mozilla Foundation, a nonprofit foundation that makes Firefox, has a VPN solution that's really affordable and it's really security and privacy oriented, because your information is flying over your entire neighborhood now, unencrypted. So helping people understand that, and again, building a solution set on a technical side that is open source first and privacy centered first. And of course, we encourage people to learn about Mozilla when we do digital literacy, so they understand, okay, it's not by default sucking all of your data and selling it to the highest bidder. It is privacy oriented by default and turns off third-party tracking by default. That's a part of our technical commitment and what we encourage other people to do, and we're happy to always share with people what nonprofit or open source led technologies are out there to get the job done, so people's privacy is protected by default.
Yeah, and one thing that I also wanted to uplift as part of this conversation is also just privacy around data collection. So right now we're seeing a lot of different entities collecting data to better understand what communities we're serving, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, the city of Long Beach received $40 million in CARES Act funding, and then $1 million was allocated towards digital inclusion. And part of our goal was to ensure that we're reaching communities that are most affected by the digital divide during the pandemic. So we have to collect a lot of data and information on communities, especially based on race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, to make sure that we're reaching the communities that are impacted. And we do see a lot of hesitancy with wanting to share that information. And I feel like that also goes along with privacy, because if we share that information with you, what are you as the government going to do with that information? And I think that's also part of the distrust and mistrust that we talk about, and ensuring that we're partnering, as Chrissy mentioned, with community-based organizations as we're doing this work. So that way communities are also able to understand that it's essential for us to collect this information, and we'll ensure that we won't tie any personal identifying information to the data that we're collecting, to ensure that we're able to serve you as our community, and ensuring that we're doing that through an equitable standpoint. So that's one of the issues that we're seeing, because since we're getting this money from the federal government, we do have to collect a lot of information, and communities for whatever reason, and for good reasons, don't want to disclose that information. But we have to collect that information for us to see how we're reaching. And we're also seeing that right now with COVID-19 testing, now with vaccinations. So I think it's important for us to understand why communities typically don't feel comfortable also disclosing certain information, and for us to also work closely with those that already have the trust and have relationships in the community to help us break down some of those trust barriers that we're experiencing. For us at the City of Long Beach, we also have a Smart Cities initiative, and they're also looking a lot at data privacy. So that's something that will also be uplifting once we have finalized our digital inclusion roadmap, which is our strategic plan for Long Beach.
Great, thank you so much. And one of those groups that may not feel comfortable, sharing their data is immigrant communities, right? So can you all kind of talk a little bit about the relationship between closing a digital divide and immigrant communities, if that's some of the work that you're doing?
I can only mention briefly without oversharing information, right? So my initial foray into digital inclusion actually happened on accident. I didn't plan on being like a digital inclusion practitioner. I was looking at homelessness, then I stumbled upon social isolation, and I realized the common thread through social isolation and homelessness was actually the lack of resources digitally. So when Erase the Red Line first opened, it was a partnership between myself and my partner who owned a barbershop. And we wanted to be able to work with community to set a safe space for individuals who look like us to come and share information in a safe space and get referrals to mental health resources they wanted to, right? So trying to look at all different social determinants of health. One of the individuals who came in happened to be a member of clergy who had a safe haven for many undocumented individuals. So with the resources that I had at that time, I had to say, okay, people are going to want to see evidence of what I'm providing, who I'm providing to what. And I personally had to, make the choice to say, yeah, I'm not going to track any information, and I'm just going to give this to them because I know that's what they need. So I think depending on the type of organization you have and what your leadership looks like, you're going to be able to really be innovative with the way that you provide resources to those who really need it. And I think that goes back to the trust and why some people would rather do things through a for-profit versus a nonprofit. So there's not as much tracking and you don't have to provide as much information, and actually being that bridge that connects other organizations from social justice organizations to anti-poverty organizations to particular communities to say, hey, you can trust this group because I'm recommending them to you, and telling that group that you're referring them to, hey, some of the things that occur here, you may have to just put it on my tab or use some of my social capital later on, but I need for this thing to happen. And that goes back into the networking and who you're actually going to be able to be connected with as well. So back to the capacity. So I know that's a lot, but sometimes just having to make things work because it's the right thing to do versus what you're going to get back in return from it is one of my rules of thumb.
And I can speak to that as well. So for me, I'm Ugandan American. So I grew up in a household where my parents immigrated here from Uganda and having to live through a lot of those different cultural practices while they were trying to make a life for themselves and achieve the American dream in San Diego. So, one of the biggest things that I have learned just from growing up with my parents and obviously also my extended family is the relationships and the trust that come directly from people who you know. And so that's something too that we're seeing here in Long Beach is that the relationships and the trust with working closely with the immigrant community are going to come directly from the community-based organizations and also direct family members and friends who could ultimately relay that information. So I'll share one perfect example with you guys. So for example, my father is 62 and he hates going to the doctor. He doesn't like going to the dentist and doesn't like doing anything that has to do with any type of healthcare or medical professional. And so for me, because I work for the government, I'm able to talk to him about vaccinations and ensuring that he's protecting himself during the pandemic. And because I've been able to talk to him and share with him, he actually sent me a picture last week of him going on his own to get the vaccine, which is completely unheard of. But it's because of that trust and relationship of me talking with him to encourage him to do that. It didn't come from the government of where he lives. It came directly from a family member who encouraged him to do that type of that action. And I feel like that's what we have to work closely with when we're working with our immigrant communities is those trusted messengers who can relay that information and serve as ambassadors for the community resources and services that we're trying to share. And now my dad can now share with his friends and also family members that he took it. And now he trusts the process. And that's now going to be some type of continued messaging that we're now doing within our household. So I just wanted to share that sometimes it's just us relying on those individual relationships to ultimately spread the work that we're trying to do.
All right, great, thank you. So I majored in journalism in undergrad, so I have to ask the question, the final question here. Is there anything that you all want to share that I may not have asked during this panel? It's 2:25, so we can do kind of a lightning round if you guys have about 45 seconds of something that you want to share or leave our audience with. And I'll start with James.
Well, I am really impressed with both the quality of the answers as well as the people who are contributing silently, but we can see the text feed online. So much energy around this. I am just thinking, I was actually just thinking just now, oh, City of Long Beach, that's in California. There's a digital inclusion innovation challenge that the state put on for kind of a moonshot kind of idea of really coming up with something that's more than just paying ISPs, to keep people from being kicked off their internet plan. Like, come up with something that's comprehensive, full stack, engages the community, creates jobs, is sustainable, gives you 100 megabit per second internet for $15 a month, everything. I'm a finalist in that, and I need a partner. So maybe we can partner with you, Rebecca, at the City of Long Beach to understand where we can pilot our solutions, because I have between April and August to do that. So my solution is basically, how do we make this all turnkey so people can create their own ISPs, build their own technology, support their own technology, create jobs, and it kind of lives and thrives locally. And to do that heavy lifting on the engineering side for people, and then it becomes almost just like you set up your own Wi-Fi router at home. You don't need to have a lot of hand-holding with it. That's what we want to use as our solution set. Obviously, there's technology around it, but love to make sure I have a community partner who lives there and who understands visual inclusion. So that's my surprising news.
All right, great, thank you. Chrissy, any last words for our audience?
Yeah, well, firstly, I just want to thank everybody, for taking their time out to hear, this discussion and to learn and to contribute. I would just say, just keep connecting and stay plugged in. There's so many, passionate and creative minds, not just within this panel, but throughout the country. There are groups and people who are pushing initiatives to bridge this digital divide. So I would just encourage you all to keep it up. Let's not let it die down. As COVID dies down, let's ensure that this energy and the spotlight on the digital divide continues until we close that gap. Which is going to take many years. But I just would hope that, as people get vaccinated and as people get back into the swing of things and in-person doctor's appointments, that we not forget the need for digital access, digital inclusion, connectivity, devices, and digital literacy skills training. So I'll close with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Quincy, what about you? Any last words?
Yes, there's strength in numbers. Digital inclusion is extremely important for every single individual, right? So we need to consider, how do we increase the amount of practitioners and the number of practitioners? And oftentimes we don't look at our immediate networks and say, hey, they will benefit from this information. So look at your professional networks, look at your reference networks, look at the individuals that you know, and try to get them linked with NDIA so we can continue to do some of the work that we do, because it's important to make these things clear and to say, okay, if you're not willing to, then why not? And that could spark a different conversation, especially for those professional organizations that consider themselves helpers. Then what's your hesitance in actually joining an alliance like this to do the work that you're supposed to be doing anyway? That's all I have.
Thank you. And Rebecca, any final thoughts?
Yes, it was definitely a pleasure being on this panel with you all. And I just want to uplift the Black excellence and the wisdom that has been shared today. So thank you guys so much for being in this space. And as I'm just reflecting on all of the great work that everyone has shared, I think it's important for us to remember that advancing digital inclusion, especially while advancing racial equity, does take time. It's important for us to make sure that we're equipping ourselves, practicing self-care, especially during this process. I remember just feeling so overwhelmed and exhausted, especially last summer with all of the different current events that were taking place and having to show up at work and still be present while having conversations about digital inclusion, racism, and everything else that comes along with my job. And I just remember having such a supportive network of my friends, and especially my friends of color, who were able to support me in ensuring that I'm, able to not only rest, but also feel free to express anything that's on my mind that's not allowing me to be my best self during this time. So I just encourage you guys to take care of yourselves. Remember to recharge, because this work is going to take some time, and to learn ultimately from each other. I think what we've learned today is that we all have a lot of rich best practices. So tap into one another. If you heard something from this panel discussion today that you love, don't hesitate to reach out. We're all here to help one another and do this work to advance digital inclusion.
Great, thank you all. It was great to be in community with you all today. And then thank you again to Angela and the NDIA team for making space for us. I'm going to turn things over to Angela for some final words.
Wow, that was incredible. We knew it would be. You all are rock stars. Thank you for doing this. There were lots of questions we couldn't get to in the chat, and so in the Q&A, know that we are now going through those list of questions and figuring out which ones we can put into other panels to make sure that those questions get answered. For those who are new to the NDIA community, as has already been mentioned by some of our panelists, join us, right? It's an open, we're here to share information. There's lots of information on the website. We welcome you. So I'm going to pass it now. Caitlin is going to put up our thank you slide, which will just be up as everybody rolls off, and the recording goes live tomorrow. So big thanks to all of our panelists, and have a great day.